Alan Moore wrote V as a terrorist, but the film turned him into a hero. Alan Moore spent years saying the film misunderstood the central idea of his work, but nobody listened. Today, the Guy Fawkes mask is one of the most recognizable protest symbols in the world. The comic that produced it was warning us about what happens when the resistance begins to resemble the thing it opposes. Let's set the stage. There is precisely one V for Vendetta film. It was written by James McTeague, and the Wachowskis wrote the screenplay. The most important change concerns the origin of the regime. In the comic, Norsefire rises after a genuine catastrophe. A frightened population accepts authoritarian rule because it promises order. The film replaces that foundation with a manufactured terrorist attack orchestrated by Norsefire itself. The shift relocates responsibility away from the public and into the regime's leadership. Secondarily, the method shift centers on V's actions across the story. The comic stages V as a methodical torturer. He systematically destroys the people who experimented on him, using their same methods against them. His treatment of Evey is psychologically brutal. He kidnaps her, holds her in a recreated detention facility for months, lets her believe the regime has captured her, and forces her through the same psychological breaking process the regime used on him. The film compresses this sequence, softens the framing, and converts what was a horrifying treatment of a young woman into a kind of difficult initiation that produces a liberated subject. The audience is invited to read the sequence as growth rather than as the atrocity it is. The third shift centers on the ending. Moore ended his comic with V dead, Evey taking up the V identity, and the streets filling with rioters whose political program is genuinely uncertain. The film ends with a masked crowd marching on Parliament exploding, and a unified mass political action the audience reads as triumphant. Moore leaves the political future uncertain. The film closes on a triumphant act of collective action. Moore objected to every one of these changes. He took his name off the film. He has said in interviews that the film fundamentally misunderstands the work, but is also the work he was warning against the whole time. Open the comic and read it as the work Moore and Lloyd actually produced. Norsefire governs a society shaped by catastrophe. The regime promises stability, certainty, and protection, and the population accepts the bargain. Moore's attention remains fixed on the conditions that made acceptance possible. V enters the story as a survivor of Larkhill. He pursues the people responsible for the facility through a campaign of calculated violence. The killings carry the logic of retribution, and each victim encounters a version of the suffering they helped create. The political vision driving the campaign is anarchist. V seeks the destruction of state authority and the removal of the structures that sustain it. The collapse itself is treated as the end goal. Most political stories spend enormous energy imagining the society that comes after the revolution. Moore largely declines to do so. The comic's attention stays fixed on the destruction of existing structures. The future remains a possibility rather than a program. V dies near the end of the story, Evey inherits the mask, the regime collapses, and the future remains unwritten. The comic's most important sequence concerns Evey Hammond. V subjects her to an artificial imprisonment modeled on the regime's own practices. Isolation, interrogation, deprivation, and the threat of execution become instruments in a lesson he has chosen to teach. When the ordeal ends, V explains the process as a gift, and that explanation reveals the center of the character. V grants himself authority over another person's life in the service of a larger project. The certainty behind the decision matters more than the outcome here. Before we continue, I've launched channel memberships and opened up something I'm calling the Vault. The Vault includes member-only essays, early access to new videos, and the full archive of the channel's work. Membership also helps fund the next stage of these essays. My goal is to bring on a professional editor and keep raising the quality and ambition of what we're making here. Now let's come back to how this interpretation became the dominant one. Let's return to the cultural history of how this interpretation became dominant. The Wachowski film arrived in 2006 in the late period of the Bush administration. The political environment was saturated with the discussion of the war on terror, surveillance expansion under the Patriot Act, and the use of fear narratives to consolidate executive authority. The film's reframing of Norsefire as a regime that engineered terrorism to seize power landed inside the conversation as a directly contemporary parable. The reception followed accordingly. Critics and the audience read the film as anti-Bush allegory, with V as a revolutionary whose violence was justified by the magnitude of the regime he was opposing. The V mask became a recognizable symbol of dissent. Anonymous adopted the mask in 2008 during the protests against Scientology. Occupy Wall Street adopted the mask in 2011. The mask has appeared at protests across the political spectrum since, in Hong Kong, in various American cities, and in European demonstrations. The mask's meaning in those contexts is broadly anti-establishment, with whatever the establishment actually is varying by the deployment. The mask in the comic is the face of a man who mirrors the regime. The mask at the protest, however, is the face of a generic opposition, with the implication that the wearer's methods might mirror the methods of the institution being opposed stripped away. Moore has objected to the trajectory in interviews. He's also said the mask deployment at protest is in some ways an honor, and in other ways a fundamental misreading of what the work was for. The mask was supposed to make the wearer indistinguishable from the worst version of themselves. For a long time, that reading was easy to miss. The film was more popular than the comic. The mask became more famous than the character wearing it. The symbol continued to circulate while the argument that produced it gradually receded into the background. The current moment has made Moore's actual reading more legible. The warning is no longer a hypothetical. The comic describes a world in which political identities harden into moral certainties, and power becomes easier to recognize in opponents than in allies. That framework reads differently in a culture that spent years watching ideological movements accuse one another of the same behaviors. The political discourse across the last decade has produced repeated rounds of revolutionary or anti-establishment framing in which the methods of the opposition increasingly resemble the methods of the institution being opposed. As history has repeatedly shown, movements that begin as critiques of authoritarian behavior often develop authoritarian methods of their own. The comic is a sustained meditation on the symmetry between revolutionary and reactionary violence. The mask is a visual instrument that makes the symmetry legible to the average person. The contemporary deployment of the mask at protests across the political spectrum has accidentally validated Moore's argument. The Wachowski film coded V as a clean revolutionary whose methods are justified by the magnitude of the regime he is opposing. A culture trained by that film to read masked opposition as morally legible is unequipped to recognize the symmetry Moore was actually talking about. The mask is now a symbol of clean resistance, the exact opposite of the function Moore had designed for it. The speed of that transformation is easy to overlook. Most literary symbols remain attached to the original stories. The Guy Fawkes mask escaped its source material almost entirely. Millions of people recognize the image without any familiarity with Moore's comic or its political arguments. The work of reading Moore correctly has stayed where it always has. Inside the comic, the adaptations keep trying to translate without ever quite making V the monster Moore actually wanted him to be. Orwell staged the same mechanism in Animal Farm. The revolution that ends with a new leadership running the old regime's operations. The pigs became indistinguishable from the farmers. My analysis is linked here. If you're drawn to stories that challenge and inspire, subscribe and be part of the conversation. Thanks for watching, and stay copacetic.